Right, Louis, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening and goeienaand. My name is Louis de Wet, the 6-year killer, and I'll be presenting chapter 15 on semiconductors and the diode. And if you follow in your text, in your handbook from page 129 till 139, so our learning outcomes tonight is introduction to semiconductors, N-type and P-type semiconductors, the junction diode, half-wave and full-wave rectification, the Zener diode, Varicap diode, and diodes as switches. We're first going to look at some of the definitions we covered in the beginning of the syllabus and briefly touch on them, namely conductors and insulators. Now, conductors are materials in which electrons can move freely and conduct electricity, and it's called conductors. This part is just an introduction before we look at the text. And characteristics of conductors: electrons can flow freely because they are not strongly bound to their nuclei, and electrons are free to move around in the material as long as other electrons replace them whenever they move. Insulators, and is an electrical insulator is a material whose electrons do not flow freely and therefore make it very hard to conduct an electric current under the influence of an electric field. So obviously conductors are wires like copper and silver and so on. Insulators are plastic that we use to, and ceramics which we use to insulate conductors. Before we start with semiconductors, we need to clarify a number of points about or differences between conductors, insulators, and semiconductors. Now, first we look at the basis of the relative values. You're not going to be examined on this, but I think it's necessary that you understand the concepts that I'm going to explain to you to fully understand what semiconductors are about. So, if we look at the electrical conductivity, that's the small letter sigma, or resistivity, which is the reciprocal, or the 1 over sigma of solids. We can broadly classify them as follows. So metals possess a very low resistivity or a very high conductivity. So resistivity, which we measure in ohms per meter, will typically range between 10 to the minus 2 or 10 to the minus 8 ohms per meter. Or the conductivity will be very high, 10 to the power of 2 to 10 to the power of 8 Siemens per meter. So if you want to know what Siemens and conductivity and resistivity is, just go read up and you'll understand. In contrast, semiconductors are more or less in the middle, have resistivity or a conductivity which is intermediate to metals and insulators. So you'll see the resistivity is more or less in between, ranging between 10 to the minus 5 and 10 to the 6 ohms per meter. So they can go, the resistivity can go from very low to very high. While metals, they are all very low. While the conductivity can go from very high, 10 to the power 5, to very low, 10 to the minus 6 Siemens per meter. And then the last one, insulators, have a very high resistivity, but a low conductivity. So the resistivity, as we see down there, ranges between 10 to the power of 11 to 10 to the power of 19 ohms per meter. So it's a very high resistivity and a very low conductivity, which is 10 to the minus 11 to 10 to the minus 19 Siemens per meter. If you just understand and know what this is all about, it will give you the picture of the differences in the scientific term, what the differences are between conductors, semiconductors, and insulators. So you'll see semiconductors is more or less in the center, and they have characteristics under certain conditions of insulators and then also of conductors. Right, now going further the band theory of solids, you can go in very deeply into the band theory of solids when you do the chemistry of and physics of these things, but we're going to simplify it quite significantly. Now, if you look at for a conductor in the inside of the atom, there's the nucleus and the electrons, which are bound very close to the nucleus, but then we have what we call on the outside the conduction band, which is quite a broad band. It's just a figure of speech that we use it here. And also there I give the conductivity and the resistivity of these elements. When you look at insulators, you've got your valence band in the inner side of the atom, but a very broad, what they call a forbidden band. And right there on the top is the so-called non-existing conduction band, which is actually empty. So there's no electrons that can flow in that conduction band, which actually doesn't exist because of the broad forbidden band. And semiconductors, they've got a valence band at the bottom, a forbidden band there in the center. As I said, it's got a dual characteristics, and also then a conduction band, which is more or less the same width as a valence band. That's very diagrammatic. Right, so let's go quickly back to the atom, protons, neutrons, and electrons. We've got an atom there with a nucleus, the atomic nucleus, consisting of protons with a positive charge and neutrons that have no charge. And around the nucleus, we have electrons that rapidly move around the nucleus in either maybe a circular or elliptical fashion. We don't know, but that's how we more or less present it. Now, we're going to work a lot with the silicon atom. Now, the silicon atom, if it's not an isotope, it has got equal amount of protons and neutrons. So for silicon, there's 14 protons and 14 neutrons. Then we've got different shells or levels in which the electrons rotate around the nucleus, and we've got the inner K shell, which only has 2 electrons, followed by the L shell, which has 8 electrons, and then M shell, which has 4 electrons, which we call the valence shell. That's the outer electrons, which interact with other atoms. So we talk about electron configuration. For those who had chemistry, you remember Niels Bohr. He was a Danish physicist who developed the electron configuration for atoms, which show different discrete levels for atoms where electrons rotate at specific energy levels. So the inner cell we call level 1, or that's the K level. There's only 2 electrons. I don't know if you can see that with my pointer there on your screen. Maybe it will. There's your K shell, or number 1. There are 2 electrons. Then layer 2, which is the L orbit, we call it orbitals. There's a total of 8 electrons. So the first one is 2s2, which is filled with 2 electrons. That's full. And then 2p6, which there's your L level, your second level. And then your third outer level. Your S has got 2 electrons, and then the P. There's space for 6 electrons, but there are only 2, which gives you a total of 4 electrons in the outer shell of silicon. And that is, as you'll see as we go on, that's very significant. Then we look at germanium. That's also one of the semiconductor elements that we use. And the germanium atom has got 32 protons, 41 neutrons, and then 32 electrons. And you'll see 1s2, 2s2, 2p6. That is full. That's the K layer. 3s2, 3p6, 3d10. That's also full to the 3 layer is filled to the brim. And then we have 4s2, and that 2 should be small. And then 4p, which are 2 of the 6 electrons only there. So there's a shortage of 4 electrons. So let us just look at these electron configurations. I've got the aluminium, chromium, copper, silver and gold. So you'll see the bottom diagram. That's your first layer. N is 1, which is the K layer. N is 2, that's your L layer. N is 3, it's M layer. And that's your inner electrons, which are bound closely to your nucleus. And then we've got the outer layer, which is the energy band for the valence electrons. So if you look at aluminium, it's got 13 electrons. So your inner shell K has got 2 there. Then your L shell has got 2 sublevels, a S and a P. That's full of atoms. That's supposed to be 8. 2 in the S subshell, 6 in the P subshell. Then we look at the outer subshell, number 3, subshell 3, or M, has got 2 electrons in the S one, but the P has got 1 only. So that's your valence electron. If you look at chromium, 24, 2, 2, 6, 2, 6, 5, and then the shell N, that's a layer 4, it's got 1 electron at the outer, and that's your valence electron that moves around between the atoms. The same applies for copper. You've got 1 there in level, also in shell 4. Then we look at silver, which is a very interesting atom, and I asked a question some time ago, why is silver a better conductor than gold? And you'll see there, you've got layer K is 2, L 2 and 6, M 2, 6 and 10, and then shell 4, which is N 2, 6, 10, but then there's a gap, but that outer electron is in the O subshell, shell 5, and it's very loose, very free to move between atoms. In comparison with gold, which got an atomic number of 79, it's a bigger atom with more orbitals, and you'll see there's no gap there. The outer electron is a P layer in the P layer in subshell 6, which is also the valence electron, but it's similar to copper, chromium, and aluminium. And if you look at the conductivity of silver compared to gold, silver has got a bit better conductivity than gold and a lower resistivity than gold. It's just an interesting thing about silver and gold compared to copper, chromium, and aluminium. Now I've got this table again for aluminium and go up to gold, but I've put the semiconductors there. Now we've got silicon there with 4 atomic atom. The atomic number is 14. Subshell K is 2, and then L is 6, which is a total of 8 there. Subshell 3 has got 2 in the S suborbital and 2 in the outer valence shell 3p. Then germanium, 32 atoms, atomic number. Sorry, not 32 atoms, beg your pardon. Atomic number is 32. And we go up to subshell 4, and 4s has got 2 electrons, and 4p has got 2 electrons. You'll see silicon and germanium have got 2 outer electrons. Now, if you look at phosphorus and arsenic, you'll see the outer electrons numbers are 3 and 3 there for phosphorus and arsenic, and boron has got 1 there in the outer shell. And those are the 2 special characteristics which differentiate between silicon and germanium as a group, and phosphorus, arsenic, and boron as a group. Right, let's just look again at silicon, which has got 4 outer electrons. And there we've got 1 silicon atom in the central, surrounded by 4 other silicon atoms. And you'll see they share electrons between each other. So that whole structure is in balance there. And there we've got a lattice, a crystal lattice of silicon atoms. And this is how it looks figuratively at the temperature at 0 Kelvin. There's no movement of electrons. All the crystals are locked in there, and the electrons stay in their orbitals. When the temperature rises a bit, when it goes over minus 273 degrees Celsius, you'll see that there are holes that develop where electrons move from one atom to another. And it's a continuous movement and exchange of electrons and holes between these silicon atoms. Now, let's look at a classification of semiconductors, and you can follow in the text. Now we're actually starting with the text on page 129, and you'll see there N-type and P-type semiconductors, and we'll get to that now. So let's first look at the classification of semiconductor types. First, we have intrinsic semiconductors and then also extrinsic semiconductors. And then you'll see that actually there in the introduction of your text there, page 129. So intrinsic semiconductors are made of only of one type of atom. That's pure silicon. Only silicon atoms in that crystal, nothing else. Then extrinsic. External impurities are added, and this is done by the process of doping. This is done to modify the conductivity of the crystal. So that's very important, this doping that we're going to talk about. So now P and N-type semiconductors, and we'll first look at P-type semiconductors. And you'll see on page 125, they first discuss N-type and then P-type. I've just switched it around. Now, trivalent items are added to the semiconductor lattice of when you do your doping of your silicon. So these atoms have 3 electrons in the outer shell, and examples of such dopants are boron, aluminium, or gallium. So what happens with doping is when they do doping, they melt the silicon at a very high temperature, and they add a very accurate amount of either boron, aluminium, and gallium, and it's mixed thoroughly, and it's left to crystallize. So the boron, aluminium, and gallium atoms are spread uniformly between the silicon atoms and in this crystal lattice. So you can read through the whole section there in 129. I'm just going to save some time, but I really need you to read these 2 paragraphs very carefully to see what is meant by what we say there. So there's boron, for example, which has 3 outer electrons. And if we put boron, if boron is mixed into this crystal lattice, we've got it there in the center. We've got what we call, there's a hole. Right, and there your silicon atoms are arranged around it. So P-type semiconductors have an excess of holes, right? And they have a high density to accept electrons. So electrons can easily go into that holes and fill it up. So we're talking figuratively, actually. Right, N-type semiconductors. So this is just a quick summary of what is written there on page 129. So very carefully read through that. Pentavalent atoms are added to the semiconductor lattice, and these atoms have 5 electrons in the outer shell. Examples of such dopants are arsenic, phosphorus, and antimony, which are added to the silicon mixture when it's melted. And there we have the 5 valence electrons. So there you have the phosphorus in the center and surrounded by silicon. And there you see, there you have a free electron, which can jump wherever it wants. And there's also the reference where you can go and look at this video. Right, let's just summarize it. And that's what is written there on page 129. N-type semiconductors are created by doping silicon with phosphorus, for example. N-type semiconductors have a larger electron concentration than hole concentrations. The phrase N-type comes from the negative charge of the electron in that crystal lattice. In N-type semiconductors, electrons are the majority carriers and holes are the minority carriers. The free electrons will be free to migrate around the crystal lattice and can serve as charge carriers, allowing a current to flow if a potential is applied. We'll come back to that a bit later. Typical chemical manipulation, phosphorus has been added to silicon. In a P-type semiconductor, P-type semiconductors are created by doping an intrinsic semiconductor with accepted impurities I think about a common p-type dopant for silicon is boron. As opposed to n-type semiconductors, p-type semiconductors have a larger hole concentration than electron concentrations. The phrase p-type refers to the positive charge of the hole. In p-type semiconductors, holes are the majority carriers and electrons are the minority carriers. So that summarizes those two paragraphs there on page 129. So let's look at the junction diode, and that's now on page 130. And now we'll see how p-type and n-type, how shall we call it, pieces of semiconductors interact with each other. So if you make a piece of p-type semiconductor and you put it against a piece of n-type semiconductor, you'll see the following happens. And you'll see there on the top of page 130. It says here, suppose a small piece of p-type semiconductor is brought into contact with a small piece of n-type semiconductor. The contact area between them is called the p-n junction. Right, there we've got the picture. There's a p-n junction. Right. So, because the n-type material has some free electrons, some of these can migrate across the boundary and fill some of the holes in the lattice structure of the p-type material. This migration will leave the p-type material negatively charged when it moves from n-type to p-type. To start, they were both neutral since the extra electrons in the n-type material were balanced by additional positive charges on the nuclei of the phosphorus or arsenic atoms for doping. Since the lack of electrons in the p-type material is precisely balanced by the smaller positive charge of the nuclei of the boron and aluminium atoms. All right. So a very thin layer called the depletion layer has been formed at the junction between the p-type and n-type materials, and we can now see that there are no or very few free charge carriers, since the free electrons from the p material have all been used up and filled the holes on the p-type side of the junction. So they move from right to left to fill up the holes in the p-type. Right. And that's what I read here, paragraphs 3 to 5, 3, 4, and 5. So yeah, that's what I if you just take care in reading those 3 paragraphs and making sure you understand there. A movement from electrons from the p-type semiconductor to the from the n-type to the p-type leaves the n-type positively charged and the p-type gets negatively charged. Right. So there it. Right. So next up, now they say there at the bottom, let's apply a potential difference across the junction with a positive terminal attached to the p-type material to the left, and the negative terminal has got the n-type material. So on the n-type on the right-hand side, I've put these little figures in there. So you've got the electrons there on the right-hand side and the holes on the p-type on the left-hand side, and the movement of electrons across the depletion region, and you've got the negative terminal connected to the n-type and the positive at the other side, the p-type, and then you've got a drive of electrons from the negative terminal of the battery into the n-type material, across the barrier into the p-type, and you've got a circuit flowing there. Right. The battery will pump electrons into the n-type material and towards the depletion region, and similarly, the positive potential applied to the p-type material will attract the electrons away from the depleted region. And it's all there on page 131. You can read that through there also. So I'm just trying to summarize what is written there. We're not going to read everything through there. It's going to take too long. But I think you understand the concept there with this figure. So let's just read here about the forward bias voltage. To make this current flow, there must be sufficient potential difference to overcome the potential difference that existed across the junction between the N-type and P-type materials due to the migration of electrons from the N-type material to the P-type material where the depletion layer was formed. This voltage is known as the forward bias voltage and is typically between 500 and 800 millivolt in the silicon PX junctions and around 100 to 200 millivolt for germanium voltage. If the potential difference applied is less than this bias voltage, electrons won't be forced into the depletion region in the N-type or removed from the P-type. So the depletion region will not have any free charge carriers and no current will flow. So you'll have to have that 500 millivolt to just get this thing, as we say, kick-started. Right, let's see what happens if the potential is connected other way around, with a positive terminal attached to the N-type material and a negative terminal to the P-type material. So there's the other way around, and immediately electrons rush from the P-type, from the negative terminal of the battery into the holes of the P-type material, and it just fills it up, and there it goes, and it remains there. Right, so electrons are forced into the P-type material, making it more negatively charged. Subsequently, electrons are removed from the N-type material, making it more positively charged. And you'll see it also there on the figure on page 131. And that's a reverse biased PN junction. Right, and you'll see it there on page 131. And you can just read it very carefully just below the figure there. And there we got, this is a very old diode that I have there, and you can see the junction there more or less between the P-type and the N-type material. Junction diode. And there you see the symbol, the anode and the cathode there. The direction of the current flow from the anode right through to the cathode and through that junction there. Right, we're going to look at rectifiers. And first off, we're going to look at the half-wave rectifier. If you just look on at the top of page 132, you can just look at that graph there, and you'll see what they say about the current there. I'm just quickly going to read that for you. The two terminals of the, let me just see, okay. The two terminals of a diode are called the anode and the cathode. The diode will allow a current to flow if the anode is more positive than the cathode by at least the amount of the forward bias voltage, which is 200 to 800 millivolt. The current flows in the direction of the arrow from left to right in that diagram. If the diode is reverse biased, only a tiny current, a reverse leakage current, will flow. So let's look here, and you can just read there, and you'll see the graph below, plus the voltage across the diode against the current flowing through the diode, using the convention that a positive voltage means the diode is forward biased, and a negative voltage means it's reverse biased. When the diode is forward biased, no current flows until the voltage exceeds the forward bias voltage of the diode, or VF. Once the voltage exceeds VF, you'll see it here on the graph, the current rises rapidly with little change in the voltage across the diode. For this reason, it is a good approximation to assume that the voltage across a forward bias diode is always VF, the forward bias voltage. All right. So let's look at the rectifiers. Ek weet nie hoe lyk ons tyd. Ek hoor redelik dit word nie nog te lank te vat nie. Henry, hoeveel tyd het jy nodig? Hallo?
Well, Louis, ja, jy moet maar gaan. Ons sal maar miskien net ons sal sien. When I get there, we'll see how much time I need.
Right. Okay, I'll quickly go through this. The half-wave rectifiers. And you'll see the graph there. Diodes are commonly used as rectifiers to convert alternating current voltages into DC voltages. And you have to read, you'll have to spend some time reading through the material. For example, consider the circuit on the left, which is known as a half-wave rectifier. And that's a very simple configuration there, just one diode with alternating current going in, and you measure the voltage coming out. And you'll see there, if you look at the red line, you'll see you've got a pulse of positive voltage going up and then going down, and then it's 0 for the second 180 degrees of the sine wave, then it goes up again, and then it goes 0 again. So the output voltage follows the input voltage during the positive half cycles, but it's always slightly less than the input voltage due to the forward bias voltage. You'll see the red line is slightly lower. It's more or less minus 0.6 volt than the blue line, and that is across the diode. During the negative half cycles, the diode does not conduct, and the output voltage is 0. You'll see the red line going flat there with all the negative half cycles of the sine wave. So there, I've just put these figures in to make it just a bit easier for you to understand. So that's the unfiltered output from the half wave. That's number A. The output there is just these pulses, positive pulses with 0 voltage in between. So in the top figure, figure B, when the next pulse does arrive, it charges, okay, say when you put a capacitor there now in, it charges the capacitor back to full charge as shown to the right. The thick line shows the discharge waveform of the capacitor. So you'll see it charges up and it discharges a little bit, charges up again with the full, the positive cycle. And if you've got this like a sawtooth wave that's coming out, and you'll see number C, the load scenes are reasonably constant, but with a ripple voltage on top of it. And you'll see the bottom figure, you've got the capacitor charging up, going down a bit, charging up, going down a bit. So that's when you get half-wave rectification. It's not a good way to get a good constant supply to any apparatus that you're going to need. So full-wave rectifier. So we're going to discuss now. Half-wave rectifiers suffer from excessive ripple because they give 0 voltage output for just over half of each cycle. The full-wave rectifier shown below is better in this regard. It's shown to the left. When the V in is positive, D1 and D3 will conduct and V out will be positive. When V in is negative, D2 and D4 will conduct and V out will still be positive. And that's the nice thing about the full-wave rectifier. And I've made some, I'm going to show you this now. I took this figure and I'll show you in the next slide. Okay, let's just read this first. Or again, you put a capacitor in to smooth it. The output voltage is now positive during both the positive and the negative half cycles of the input voltage. Note that the output voltage is also always 1.2 volt lower than the input voltage. This is because there are now two 0.6 volt forward voltage drops across the two conducting diodes. You'll see the red one is now double lower than the blue sine wave. Note also that the frequency of the ripple of the output is now twice than the input frequency. So if we've got 50 hertz AC, the output will now be 100 hertz. Once again, the amount of ripple on the output can easily be reduced by using a suitable smoothing capacitor as a low-pass filter on the output. Just want to show you this again. I've taken this diagram. When V in is positive, you can see your current runs from there through D in, D1, through your apparatus that you want to use, goes through it, goes back into your circuit through D3, and again completing that circuit. When V in is negative, it goes, where does it go now? It goes through there, up there, right, it follows that path, and back into your alternating current circuit. So that's how the two work there. Okay, so that's easy. There's got another figure there. Okay, but we're not gonna write. Just to make it clarify, I'm sure you're going to, you'll be able to see it when you look at the presentations. And there's a circuit diagram of a full wave rectifier with a capacitor filter. There's the 4 diodes, and there you've got your capacitor and your load. Right, let's look at the Zener diode. Sorry, I think we have to go through it quite a bit quicker. All right, in most diodes, the reverse breakdown voltage VR should never be exceeded, or the diode will be permanently damaged. I've done it in the past. You put a lot of voltage, it actually just explodes. However, a specific type of diode, the Zener diode, is manufactured in which the reverse breakdown voltage can safely be exceeded. Zener diodes are also manufactured in such a way that the reverse breakdown voltage, also known as the Zener voltage, or abbreviated as VZ, is specified and can be carefully controlled. The Zener diodes are available with Zener voltages ranging between 2 volt and 100 volt. Now, the purpose of a Zener diode is the following. The diagram shows an input voltage in a range of 6 volt to 10 volt there, being applied across a Zener reversed bias Zener diode with a Zener voltage of 5 volt. It's actually a regulation voltage. The purpose of the resistor, which is R there, is to limit the current flowing through the Zener diode, and is preventing it from being destroyed. So it flows through there to your output. Note the circuit symbol for the Zener diode. If the output voltage rises above 5 volt, the Zener diode conducts strongly, even though it's reversed bias, so it conducts through there. The current flowing through the Zener diode causes a voltage drop across so it bleeds current off the resistor, reducing the output voltage until it's close to 5 volt. So the effect is that the voltage that goes out to your output stays on 5 volt. It regulates it. So in this way, the circuit will maintain a fairly constant output voltage of around 5 volt, irrespective of both the input voltage and the current draw. So it bleeds off any excessive current, voltage that comes through, and it ensures that your output voltage stays on 5 volt. In this way, the reverse bias Zener diode functions as a voltage regulator, maintaining a constant output voltage despite fluctuations in the input voltage and load current. Now, the VariCap diode, you can see, okay, this, what I explained, it was on page 136. And then the VariCap diode, I'm just going to see what the VariCap diode, yeah, this is page 136. So they say, think back to the physical description of the reverse biased P-N junction. It consists of 2 conducting materials, a P-type and N-type semiconductors, separated by the thin, non-conducting depletion layer. This description is very similar to the description of a capacitor. 2 conducting plates separated by a thin insulating layer. Indeed, all reverse bias diodes do act as capacitors to some extent. Most diodes are designed to minimize the capacitance effect so that it becomes negligible except at very high frequencies. However, some diodes are designed to maximize this capacitance effect and to allow the capacitance to be controlled. And that's now very nice by the reverse bias voltage supply. And it must be a variable voltage, and that's applied to the diode. So remember that the greater the reverse bias voltage, the larger the depletion layer. And this change in layer thickness is equivalent to moving the plates of the capacitor further apart, and it means that the capacitance will be reduced. This is called the VariCap. This is a wonderful type of diode, and the other term is a varactor diode. So that's I've written it there. And it's all on your text there on page 136. So we've got a VariCap diode circuit there. on the bottom, page 136. In this circuit, DC bias voltage, V bias, is used to reverse bias varicap diode D1. As the bias voltage is changed, the capacitance of D1 is changed. And there you've got your varicap diode in the center. So the bias voltage goes up and down, and it changes the capacitance of the varicap diode of D1. This will vary the resonant frequency of the parallel tuned circuit made up of L2, C1, and D1. That part, D1, C1, L1, L2, is a resonant circuit. And note that the capacitance in the parallel tuned circuit consists of a C1 in series with a varicap diode there. L1, which is to the left, prevents the AC signals present in the tuned circuit from flowing through the bias voltage source, which would induce undesirable losses into the tuned circuit, reducing its Q. Similarly, C1 prevents the DC bias voltage from being shorted through L2. Circuits like this are often used to vary the frequency of oscillators, circuits that we use to generate LI signals in response to a DC tuning voltage. I just want to see where we are now. Okay, really kept that. All right. So right, I don't have I'll put it in for the next lecture. I see diodes as switches, and I'm just going to read here the next couple of paragraphs, and then we'll go to the review questions. Now we've got diodes, and if you look at page 137, diodes are switches. This is very interesting, and we're just going to read through that. And although it might appear surprising as first, diodes are also often used as switches in radio frequency applications. And then we've got a circuit diagram of a diode RF switch with a conductor there in the center coming from, and with the capacitor coming from the left into a diode through a resistor to the ground, and then there's a capacitor B on the right-hand side, or C. We've got C1, D1, and C2. Now suppose that AC voltage is applied to point A going into the capacitor, and the question is, will it reach B? Let us first assume that the control voltage X, there on top going into the inductor, is positive with respect to the chassis, and that's the figure there at just below the resistor. The DC current will flow through inductor 1 and diode D1 and to the chassis via resistor 1. The conducting metal chassis is represented by the symbol below the resistor. It looks like a little fork there. Because the diode is forward biased, as you see there, it offers very little resistance to the flow of current. So a signal applied to point A is coupled through capacitor C1, diode 1, and capacitor 2 to point B. As long as the signal applied at A is significantly smaller than the control voltage applied at X, the signal will not be rectified, since the diode will be forward biased even during the negative peaks of the signal. Now, if we reverse the voltage, now consider what happens if a negative voltage with respect to the chassis is applied to X. Now, D1, obviously, trying negative from the chassis through resistor 1 to the diode D1 will now be reverse diode, will be reverse biased, and will not conduct current. Again, assuming that the signal applied at A is significantly smaller than the control voltage, the diode will remain reverse biased even at the positive peaks of the signal. Hence, the signal will be effectively blocked by a reversed bias diode. The role of L1 is simply to have higher resistance at the signal frequency, preventing the signal from being coupled into the control circuitry, while allowing the DC control current to flow unimpeded. So you can read the remainder there and make sure you understand what the purpose of this circuit is and what we mean by PIN diodes. and you'll see the PIN diodes contain some in pure intrinsic silicon between the N and P regions, hence the abbreviation PIN. So PIN diodes switches have advantages over mechanical switches, as we call them relays. They do not have an inherent lifetime limit, and they can survive a very high number of cycles. They can also switch much faster than typical mechanical diodes. So that's what the VariCap diodes, or the diodes as switches, are used for. I'm just going to conclude then with the light emitting diodes. Where are we now with time? Okay. If the semiconductor material and doping are appropriately chosen, the energy state transition about the junction can emit electromagnetic energy, and such a diode is known as a light emitting diode. Okay, that's very easy. You can just read the rest there underneath the lighting emitting diode. We all know them very well. Right, so let's just summarize. I'm just trying to get as much as possible in this the limited time. Pure semiconductors do not conduct current at room temperature, and especially not when frozen to minus 273 degrees Celsius. However, by introducing small amounts of impurities, they can be made to conduct a current. The charge carriers in N-type semiconductors are negatively charged electrons, while in P-type semiconductors, they are positively charged holes. That's as we discussed. When N-type and P-type semiconductors are brought into contact, a thin depletion layer with no free charge carriers forms at the junction. If the junction is forward biased by making the P-type material positive with respect to the N-type layer, a current will obviously flow, provided the potential exceeds the forward bias voltage of the junction, which is typically around 600 millivolt for silicon devices. If the junction is reverse biased by making the P-type material negative with respect to the N-type material, no current will flow until the reverse breakdown voltage is reached. Okay, then they discuss here the PN junction to make a junction diode. Next up, there are diodes are commonly used as rectifiers, and discussing the half-wave rectifier and the full-wave rectifier. Then the next paragraph is Zener diodes and VariCap diodes, and then PIN diodes, which are used as switches at radio frequencies. And then last up, light emitting diodes or LEDs provide light in virtually any color very efficiently. So if we look at our questions, and I presume everybody is going to participate here. Let's look at the first question, and you can switch on your voice, what do you call it, your microphones. And the first question is: the forward biased diode will allow current to flow through the junction, block current from flowing, have a high resistance, or exhibit a Zener diode function. What would your answer be there?
Hey.
Daar's hy, pragtig. Sorry. Second question. In a silicon diode, the voltage of 600 millivolt refers to breakdown voltage, forward bias voltage, Zener voltage, or cutoff voltage.
Forward bias.
You say B. Yeah? Yeah, correct. Which of the following components is intended only to operate in the reverse bias condition? We just discussed it now.
B.
Yeah, Zener diode. The term VZ is commonly used to describe
Zener diode regulating voltage.
All right. I've got it there on the. Where did we say that now? Just want to show it to you. Yeah. The Zener voltage abbreviator. Okay, got it there. Number 5, by allowing alternating current to flow into one direction in one direction, a diode can be used as.
Rectifier.
C.
C.
Yes, you're right. Rectifier. Zener diodes are also used to
Regulate.
regulate the DC voltage supply. Right. What function does a full wave bridge circuit or bridge? Nearly said it. What function does a full wave bridge circuit serve?
C.
Rectification. C.
Yes, rectification. A circuit which allows only half an AC waveform to pass through is called?
Half-wave rectifier.
That's right, yeah. Right, a 4-diode circuit to produce full wave rectification, rectify DC from a transformer is called?
B. Bridge rectifier.
Bridge rectifier, yeah. Right, the area of a diode junction where no free electrons or holes or electrons exist is called the?
Depletion region.
Yeah, depletion area. Right, and the last one, an AP8. A PN-type semiconductors refers to a?
Diode.
Diode, yeah. Okay, that's all the questions there. Do you have any other questions? I know I'm not as learned as my fellow presenters, but I'm sure. I hope I answered or the lecture was clear enough for you. You can ask anything about the chemistry. That I can help you very well.
Thank you, Meneer. You're talking to Mani, yeah? I have a question.
Yes.
Will we require to know many of the circuitry symbols?
Symbols of like a capacitor or a diode.
Yeah, all the
I
symbols,
think that would, that must be part of your knowledge. I'm not sure how much you're going to be maybe examined on, but that should be part of your knowledge packet anyway when you do the study for the amateur. Just make sure you know all the, like a resistor and a capacitor and a battery. That should form part of and package of your body of language, as I can call it that. But try and learn as much as possible and to recognize a basic circuit. There's an alternating current coming in, there's a capacitor, there's an inductor, and so forth. It must be, you must really know them, yeah. Okay. I hope with this explanation that you understand. I think that for me, I'm not saying there's a gap in the syllabus, but going through this whole electron valency thing and the theory of how these atoms, I hope it will give you a better idea of how semiconductors work. Okay, but thank you if there's no questions.
Thanks, Louis.
Good, dankie, Henry.
Daar sê Louis, dat as jy ophou share, dan kan ek share en dan kan ek gaan met my kant.
Ja, ek gaan so 'n bietjie luister.
Jy's welkom. Okay. You're more than welcome.
Okay, so then I go stop sharing daar, so nee. Okay. Okay.
Right, now theoretically you should be able to see my screen. Now most of this you've already seen. So I'm going to fly through this because I'm just basically going to explain what is happening in different power supplies. So this represents the 240 volt. That's a fuse. It's a 20-to-1 transformer. We've done transformers. And that means that whatever comes out on this side should be more or less 12 volts. And that would be measured in RMS. it will go through the diodes, and we know that we've got a full bridge rectifier over here. So we'll have two diodes working in conjunction with every half cycle, which will give us an approximate loss of 1.2 volts from our output voltage. Now, because this is RMS, if we do the calculation, we'll realize that we'll get about 17 volts out after rectification, and then we deduct, which they didn't do, the 1.2 volt because of the forward bias loss on the diodes. And then we've got DC over here, and the wave that comes out at this point, sorry, let me just kill the radio here, will look something like this. Now, as you know, this would be double the input frequency, because the negative cycle has been swapped around into a positive cycle, and this is before it gets to the inductor and the capacitor. Your wave will look like this, and it will be double the input frequency. So if this is 50 hertz, you will have a frequency of 100 hertz over there. This is a low pass filter, so this will smooth out the voltage that comes out here. But you will never use a power supply like this, because this is an unregulated power supply, and it will for sure destroy your equipment. So this is just a power supply for explanation. Then we go to a regulated power supply. Now the basic principle is the same, although over here they use what they call a center tap transformer. And because they use a center tap transformer, they can get full bridge rectification with only two diodes. So this is once again positive. Same math apply. If you get 12 volts out, you will have 17 volts over there. You use a capacitor to smooth out the AC, or the DC now, but it's very rippled. So you smooth it out. This is called a voltage regulator. Now they are very common. You get them in different values. We call them the 7-8 series. You get a 7805, which is a 5-volt regulator, 7809, which is a 9-volt regulator, and 7812, and so on. They go up 15 volt, 24 volt. So, and then they regulate the voltage. For this regulator to work effectively, you need about 3 volts above the regulating voltage. So if you want to regulate 5 volts, you have to put at least 8 volts into it. If you, they can handle up to 30 volts, but they are not switching regulators. So whatever voltage it's got to get rid of gets converted into heat. So if you feed this regulator 30 volts and you want 5 volts out, it's going to be very inefficient. But this is getting better, and with adding a transistor onto this circuit, you can increase the amps or the amperes that it can handle, or the amount of power that it can handle. And this regulator standard can handle 1.5 amps, and it's got a built-in regulator and temperature protection, although it's not good to put it to the test. So when you design something, don't run your regulator on its limits. It's not going to last very long. They explained the circuit over here, like I mentioned, the center tap transformer, 14 volts in, and then your regulated voltage out. When you look at a there, this is a linear. That's a typical. The one that we went through now is typical linear power supply. So you've got your step-down transformer, rectifier circuit, your filter, your regulating circuit, and your output voltage. Here you can see AC transformer output. That's a lower voltage. You can see the amplitude is lower there. Then it's rectified. The negative section there is swapped to the top. So you've got two positive ones. Goes through the filter. The ripple is reduced. And once it's gone through the rectifying circuit, you've got a perfect DC circuit. And this is the only type of power supply, or the worst type of power supply you'll connect to a radio. Anything more crude than this would destroy your radio for sure. Then you get to switch mode power supply or switching power supplies. Now, switching power supplies has got a lot of advantages and a lot of disadvantages. The advantage is that it's very efficient. The parts are a lot smaller, your transformer is smaller, but it is very noisy. A linear power supply is not as efficient. It's bulky, it's heavy, but it's quiet. So only recently the switch mode power supply has become sophisticated enough that you can actually use it on a HF set. Previously, when you switch the switch mode power supply on, game over, then HF is gone. The disadvantage of a switch mode power supply also is that it's very complicated in comparison with a linear power supply. Now, here they've got a very elementary design of a switch mode power supply. It's a lot more complicated than this, and I will show you now. But the basic principle is that you've got your AC coming in, you rectify it. So you've got 240 volt coming in, you rectify it, and if you calculate your DC voltage then with your what's that, 0.707, just get a calculator close, so I'll quickly calculate that. Let's do it on the screen, then everybody can see. So you've got 240 volt coming in divided by 0.707 is 340 volts that you get over there. So if you touch that, you're going to know about it. But if you switch this switch at a very high frequency, which could be anything from 100 kilohertz higher, and you vary the duty cycle according to the amount of current you need to drive whatever this thing does. You've got a 1-to-1 transformer there. So if you switch it only 10% of the time, then you will have only 10% of the voltage, which will be in this case about say 30 volt half-wave rectification. So you'll get about 15 volts out. But this is very far from how the real power supply looks like. Just to go back to the real life linear power supply. Now, I found a mistake in this circuit and I wanted to change it, but I thought I'll just leave it there. I don't know if anybody can spot the mistake, but this comes from Dave Jones. He's an Australian YouTuber, and he's got a website. I can't remember the name of the site now. And I took this power supply off his website just as a demonstration of what a real power supply would look like. Like I explained, there's your 5 volt regulator. So that number 1 on J3 would be 5 volts. Number 2 on J3 would be ground, because that's the symbol for ground. There's your LED to show you that the power supply is on. But let's start here from the beginning. So we've got 240 volt coming in. There they show you a 15 wound, and it's joined together. So we've got a 30 volt AC coming out here. Then, now here's where the catch comes. You see this positive side of the bridge rectifier goes to ground. It's not good. Nothing. It's going to cause some smoke. So this bridge rectifier is installed incorrectly. This should be the positive line and this should be the negative line, because there's the positive of your capacitor, the negative of your capacitor. 4,700 microfarad 63 volt tells us that this is an electrolytic capacitor, and it's polarized because the positive is clearly marked over there. We all know that the input is positive on the 7805, so that also tells us this should be positive. So here comes your positive voltage. This regulator regulates it down to 5 volts. Although in the spec sheet they advise that you put another capacitor in here, so this is also not 100% correct. The LED will get power from there, 10K. You can calculate the voltage drop over the LED, but 10K, the LED will survive, which is good. And then we've got a LM317. Now, a LM317 is a variable regulator. So it's got a variable resistor over here, and it can be adjusted from 1.5 volts to, I think, about 1.5 volts below your input voltage. And it's also got a current of 1.5 amp. But in this circuit, they needed more current, so they added tip 3055, which is the same as a 2N3055. It's just a different package, but there's no current regulation. So this thing will give whatever you try and draw out, and if you draw too much, it will destroy the transistors. This is an amp meter, so you can basically say those 2 points are connected together so that there's conductivity through there. This is your negative output, positive output. So that's the basic explanation of a real linear power supply. Right, then we get to the switch mode power supply, and as I said earlier, that the explanation or the figure or the picture that they give you here is very, very elementary to explain a switch mode power supply. How it basically works, if we look at the block diagram, is you get 240 volt AC from your supply, goes through the rectifier, goes through a filter, and then it goes to the switching circuit. And that switching circuit is usually some kind of intelligent control which pulses your one-to-one transformer. They call it a step-down or flyback transformer, but it can also be a one-to-one transformer. Your pulse comes out the other side. It's rectified again, goes through a filter, and you've got your DC out. But because you've got an intelligent circuit, you get feedback, goes through an optocoupler, because you don't want the secondary side directly connected to mains. So the transformer has got a double purpose. One is to step down if necessary, and the other one is to insulate the secondary circuit from the mains, so that when you touch your radio, you don't get electrocuted. So it feeds back. If the voltage becomes too high, this is an LED that's in here. It starts to light up, which then puts light onto this transistor, which switches the transistor on, That tells the circuit, the PWM pulse width modulation control circuit, that there's enough power here, switch slower. And then, of course, when the light goes dim, there's too little power, and it increases the switching rate, which then will give us more voltage out. So it's a very efficient power supply, but they tend to be noisy, and your LED lights work on the same principle, and that's why the LED light is an absolute nightmare when it comes to RF noise. And they've got the whole explanation there. They tell you 100 kilohertz, high speed electronic switch. You're sitting with 340 volts there. It's going to really shake you up when you touch it. And then here they explain the advantages, that everything is smaller and it's more efficient, but it's complicated. And then we get to batteries. Now, batteries technically is also power supplies. Now, over here, they have explained the lead acid battery and the NiCad battery. Now, both of those batteries, their uses are very limited these days because we've got technology that is far better. But your car battery is still a lead acid PB battery. And there's a difference between a deep cycle battery that you'd use in a solar system and a car battery. A car battery is what they call a crank battery. So a car battery can supply a high current for a short period of time, where a deep cycle battery can supply a small current for a long period. And deep cycle battery, there's a difference in the plates. The car battery has got thicker plates, and the deep cycle battery has got thinner plates. So if you go and put the deep cycle battery in a car and you try and start the car and you draw 800 amps through the deep cycle battery, you bend the plates and they start short circuiting and the battery is destroyed. Now, when you recharge batteries, it's very important that you do it correctly. When you look at, here's a circuit. Let's quickly, before I go past this, here's an actual circuit of a switch mode power supply, where you can see the switching circuit. They've got here a flyback circuit, and on this side, you've got a voltage regulating circuit going through the optocoupler, giving feedback to that. So this is an actual power supply, switch mode power supply. Right. Then that is our old-fashioned PB, lead acid battery. PB comes from the periodic table, which says lead, and that comes from some Greek word, I think, which I can't remember the name of, but the P and the B comes out of that word. These batteries, losing control over here, maximum discharge voltage 10.5. So if you run this battery below that, and I think Louis would know how to, one day he'll explain to us what happens when the voltage goes too low, but you get a crystallization on the plates, which then causes insulation between the electrolyte and the plate, which reduces the charge that the battery can take. And a lot of people have tried, but none of them have actually gotten a solution to fix those batteries. And I've got a stack of them here. So if you know of something that works, then it would be nice to know. And I have tried everything that I could get on the internet. I came to the conclusion when this battery is broken, you throw it away or you exchange it and you buy a new one. The nominal voltage of a lead acid battery is 13.8 volts when it's fully charged. Maximum charge voltage is usually 14.2 volt. You get some that's 14 volt and others that's 14.5 volt. Some of them go as high as 15 volts. But it's important to have a look and see on the battery there will be specifications, and it's important for longevity to look after the battery. Don't over discharge the battery and don't overcharge the battery. Be careful. They always suggest to us buy intelligent chargers. I bought some of the cheap Chinese intelligent chargers, which weren't very intelligent. They destroyed the battery within a couple of days. A friend of mine, he borrowed this Vectron charger to me. It's very nice. It's got no displays on the front, but it links up with Bluetooth to your phone, and you can actually adjust all the charging parameters on this charger, and it works very well. And this one charges 12 volt, 25 amps, so that is quite a hefty charger. But you can limit the 25 to 5 amps, so whatever you want to charge. But be careful, not all intelligent chargers are as intelligent as they would like to think they are. So that is, but these batteries, don't buy them. You waste your money. Go and buy a lithium ion or a lithium lipo battery. These batteries I saw were going for 1,800 and something, and a lithium battery that is twice as efficient, lasts double this, maybe 3 times longer than this battery, is 3,000 rand. So for 1,000 rand extra, you get much more battery. Right, and then here we have a lithium ion battery. Now these batteries come with what they call a BMS, battery management system, which is this little PC board over here, and this regulates the charging, the discharging, and when the battery is considered flat, the circuit will then also switch the battery off so that you cannot over discharge them. These batteries are even more sensitive to over discharging. Once again, I think Louis can explain to us the chemistry behind it, but as far as I could understand is if you discharge this battery, I think it's less than 3.2 volts or 2.4 volts, I'm not sure, depends probably from battery to battery, then the resistance becomes eventually so high that you don't have enough voltage to charge to get the electrons to charge up again or something like that. But yeah, that is this is definitely the answer. LiPo of lithium ion, if you buy a battery, nothing less than this. If you buy lead acid, you're absolutely wasting your money. And that's the end of my external presentation. Here they explain recharging is very important. Batteries aren't 100% efficient. We know that. Lead acid batteries are probably about, I don't even think they make 70%. Right, in summary, they explain all the power supplies, 100 kilohertz, we know about that. RF interference, we know about that. A battery consists of a bunch of cells connected together. Now, those cells can be connected in series. When you connect the cells in series, that gives you a higher voltage. When you connect them in parallel, you get more current. The current of a battery is measured in amp hour, or smaller batteries a milliamp hour. So if a battery can supply 1 amp for 1 hour, it's 1 amp hour. If it can supply 1 amp for 2 hours, it's still a 1 amp hour. But they usually have a C rating. Now, the C rating tells you how fast that battery can be discharged. C1 would usually mean that the battery can be charged as fast as it can be discharged. Now, if you look at a 100 amp hour deep cycle lithium battery, it's a 100 amp hour, but a person must look very carefully, because you cannot necessarily draw 100 amps out from it. Some can handle more, some can handle less. So if you're going to connect like a 2 kilowatt inverter to a 100 amp hour battery, check the battery, do the math, and then decide whether your battery will be able to handle the maximum current that your inverter will draw. Otherwise, you're going to destroy the battery and maybe the inverter as well. Some batteries might be dangerous. Lithium batteries, very important that they are charged correctly. And that's why, fortunately, most of these off-the-shelf batteries comes with BMS, battery management system. So as long as you stick to the charging rates, you'll be safe. But if you make your own, be very careful. They come fully charged or charged at least 70%. Enough power to make trouble. When you solder or you put them together, take great care not to short circuit those terminals. And if that lithium starts burning, they don't stop. It's dangerous. Right. Then we get to the questions. The ripple frequency appearing at the output of an AC fed power supply using a full wave rectifier will be
A.
correct. To obtain a full wave rectified output from a transformer using only 2 diodes, the transformer must be
C.
center tapped on the secondary winding. That is correct. By introducing a smoothing capacitor and an inductor in a power supply output,
It's D.
the ripple will be reduced. That is correct. A smoothing circuit using an inductor and a capacitor is a standard
I.
low pass filter. That is correct. So that inductor capacitor that we saw on the first power supply is a low pass filter. A voltage regulator in a power supply can provide
I said all of the above.
all of the above. That is correct. A Zener diode is used in a power supply to
A.
stabilize a reference voltage. Yes, because Zener diodes can, in a lot of cases, only handle low current. They used as a reference. They create a stable reference voltage, and the regulating circuit then uses that to determine the output voltage. And for instance, you'll use a voltage divider with a reference, and then feed that into your voltage regulator. LM324, I think, is one of those regulators that can use a reference voltage. Smart battery chargers are recommended because
C.
correct, yes. A battery of a specific voltage can be made by
B.
The B, you said Bravo.
Said Bravo, yes.
Okay, using multiple cells in series. That's correct. And then we're done. Is there any questions? I just want to answer that one question. Somebody asked what um, symbols, electronic symbols you must know. All of the symbols that's in the book. You must be able to identify a transistor. You must be able to identify NPN transistor, a PNP transistor. You must know what the resistor looks like on a circuit diagram. You must know what a diode looks like, a Zener diode, a Vericap, LED, transformer, fuse, all of those things. What I would suggest is that we have got a YouTube channel where all these presentations have been recorded, and for the previous exam as well. So I would suggest for those who only came late would be, go and watch those videos as well, because you will most definitely need to know those things. Any other questions?
Okay, so Henry, will we talk about the next chapter, the bipolar junction transistor, on Thursday?
Correct, yes.
Yes, okay.
That's correct, yeah.
This is a short.
Unless everybody is very energetic, then we can carry on. But I'm sure everybody's brains are toast by now. Right, yeah, that's yeah. I think I don't know whether the chat from last week is still available, because I did post the YouTube channel in the online ICASA. There's the YouTube channel for the right. The other thing is that people have to now register their profiles at ICASA themselves. I know some of you have done that already. If you're not sure how to do it, please contact us so that we can help you. You have to, the SIRL is no longer going to handle people's licenses on their behalf. Each radio amateur has to do it himself. But with ICASA's website, it's very easy. I did mine myself, and then Barty went to write the exam, and ICASA did hers. And now it's back to the radio amateur doing his own license. So what will happen is you'll create a profile, and then when you get your certificates, you will submit them to ICASA, and they'll issue you with a license. So you're only going to pay $500 to SIRL, and then your license, I think, is going to be around about $200, because the total amount in the previous exam was 700 Rand. So that's something that has changed in the last 2 weeks or so. Any other questions?
Okay, we'll see you Thursday.
That's it. I'm going to stop the recording.